ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. This has so far been and continues to be a very well-attended lecture series. Thank you very much for coming. To put you in a little bit of a context of what we've discussed so far, we started 2 weeks ago with Professor Ira Robinson, who gave us some historical a history of the original migrations of the Jewish people and a little bit. So far, nobody has quite divided the Jewish world into Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Professor Robinson has, in part of the lecture, was discussing the differences between the Jews of the predominantly Christian world and Jews of the predominantly Muslim world, and the different effects that had on the Jewish people. Later, last week, we had Dr. Andrea Gondos, who divided again, or spoke about the differences of the Jews who were more in the philosophical realm of philosophy, and Jews who were more on the side of the Kabbalah and the Kabbalists. And that took us up to the Middle Ages. Now, Rabbi Steinmetz will take from there, and today we're going to talk about the switch between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and philosophy and Kabbalah, and this will all become clear. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know Rabbi Steinmetz very well. He's been the spiritual leader of the Bailey Shul of TBDJ for more than 17 years. He has a lot of credits to his name. He has his ordination from Yeshiva University, and not only that, he has a master's in Jewish philosophy and in education. Rabbi Steinmetz writes a regular column for the Canadian Jewish News, and his articles are virtually everywhere else, in the Toronto Star, the Gazette, La Presse, the Jerusalem Post, and don't forget, he is the happiness warrior on his blog, and is regularly updated with extremely fascinating and interesting articles. Rabbi Steinmetz is the driving force behind the learning at Bailey Shul, and he's very keen on the congregants' interests and needs, and clearly this is an example of a successful venture into our interests and our needs. So thank you very much, Rabbi Steinmetz.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm sorry, I'm so distracted making sure that everyone's got a seat. It's hard to be the rabbi and the lecturer at the same time, but hopefully Yaakov, I see, is keeping an eye on things, and hopefully we'll, as people come in, Yaakov will figure out a yesh etza or lo. Okay, that's fine. So Yaakov's going to help us out with the seating, and I will hopefully help you out with the lecturing. We have heard two wonderful lectures thus far about Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And what I wanted to do this evening was far too ambitious, and so I had to cut it down. And what I do want to do is I want to offer one set of contrasts between what you would call a general Ashkenazi culture and a general Sephardic culture. Now, of course, it's very difficult to talk about the two being two large cultures. Even within Ashkenaz, there is a question, but there may be a large disconnection between, let's say, the Ashkenazic Jews, who the Balei Tosfot, who grew up around Rashi's school, which is in the Champagne region, and between the Hasidic Ashkenaz, who are growing up in the Rhineland. There certainly is a difference between Sephardic Jews that are found in Spain, and we call it Sephardic, and Sephardic Jews that are found in North Africa, and Sephardic Jews that are found in the Iraq area of Babel, of Babylonia. There's enormous differences between those. And then, of course, you have the intermediate culture of Provence, which is a fascinating case in that it is at the crossroads between Spain and Germany, and they have their own culture. So we obviously can't take all of that. Last week, Dr. Gondos began talking about differences between rationalists and Kabbalists and mystics, and I'm going to take an aspect of that, although there is so much more to say about it. I said, oh my goodness, I could give 3 lectures on this. But I'm going to say one. So let's start with some points that have already been touched on, but are worth repeating, as far as differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and then to use one particular example, which we will examine at depth, which in many ways illustrates the difference of culture. And this, what I want you to feel is, what would it be like to meet an Ashkenazi Jew, perhaps, who is living in the Champagne region, who's living in the Rhineland, versus a Sephardic Jew who might be living in Spain. And we're looking really at one particular era, at the 1100s and 1200s. We're looking at a particular era. But this is an opportunity to take a look at what are the major differences. So some of the differences, first of all, obviously you need to know, is that the Ashkenazi community is relatively small compared to the Sephardic community. The exact numbers are hard to tell, but there's no question that they are small compared to the Sephardic community. The Ashkenazi community has, and this was, I think, mentioned by both of our previous lectures, has a much more antagonistic, if I may say, relationship with the surrounding culture. Not only are they less welcome by the surrounding culture, they consider themselves to be far superior to the surrounding culture, unlike Sephardic Jews who are relatively accepted by the surrounding culture. They see a surrounding culture that is rather educated. And so if you're living in the 1100s and you're living in Germany and you're living in Spain, your attitude to the surrounding culture is dramatically different. Or even, and certainly if you're living within the Muslim world, where there really is an enormous amount of learning. Spain is an anomaly because it's half, it starts out Muslim and goes Christian. And so it's a bit of a different, it's an outlier. It's a bit different. But the difference of attitude towards the surrounding community is dramatic. And that will actually have an enormous impact on the example that we've chosen for today, which is the example of martyrdom. So you have sorry, yes?
Is the difference in the way they face the community that makes them being accepted or not accepted?
Okay, so you're asking which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it that the Christians lock out the Jews? It's multifactorial, and it's hard to tell. And like I said, there is a big difference between the level of culture and learning and attitude that they're dealing with. I mean, don't forget, the type of what do you call it when you take someone and you throw them in the lake and you want to see whether or not they float, to see whether or not they're innocent, which is a trial. Anyway, the word is escaping me this evening. These are the sort of things they're looking at in the Christian world, and they don't see in the Muslim world. Is a very, very different world. So that's number two. Number three, which needs to be emphasized, and tonight, if you walk home with one piece of data, this is a very interesting piece of data. This may be one of the most critical ones. In the Ashkenazic world, there is an incredible respect for minhag. There's an incredible respect for custom at that particular time. Now, let me explain what this means. Because we all think, minhag means that, I have a minhag not to wash my hands or not to do this right? No, minhag in the Ashkenazic world will mean both for leniency and for stringency. Now, I want to mention a couple of very interesting cases that relate to this. And there are several professors who have gone through this material a great deal. In fact, what they call this, when they teach this to you in Jewish history, is they call this the history of halakha, of trying to tease out historical data from halachic texts. Halachic texts are essentially there to offer argumentation on how a Jew should follow the Jewish law and how you should interpret the Jewish law. But there are some wonderful professors, the late Jacob Katz, Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who's Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik's son, Avraham Grossman, Ephraim Kantervogel nowadays, we'll mention him later on. There are multiple people who have been very involved in this discipline. And the attitude towards minhag is very critical. Let's take one example. I didn't cite any texts on it, but just to give you an example. And I have it here in the notes, that's why I put it all here, so if you want to take a look at it. Let's take an example of dealing with Christianity as a religion that, at least from a Jewish perspective, is questionable as to whether or not you can consider it a monotheistic religion. Because Christianity accepts the Trinity. And this is a deep issue that engages Jewish philosophers. Now, Jewish rabbis in the Muslim world don't have a problem with it. They don't have a problem with it, first of all, because they don't really face the issue. Second of all, because they're living within the realm of Islam, where Islam is equally uncompromising in terms of their monotheism. In fact, Islam has even greater strictures in certain ways. They say you can't even depict prophets. But there's this idea of this uncompromising monotheism, which sees even the concept of the Trinity as unacceptable. Now, Jews living in Christian Europe, this becomes a huge problem. Because in the Talmud says there are certain rules that apply to, let's say, your economic intercourse with pagans. The first Mishnah Avodah Zarah. Anyone who's ever read Masechet Avodah Zarah, the first Mishnah in that tractate in the Talmud says that 3 days before a non-Jewish holiday, you can't do business with them because they may take the items that they buy from you or the money that they borrow from you and use it to serve an idol. And Jews see it as a universal imperative that no one can worship idols. So if Christianity is perceived, if the Trinity is perceived as some sort of a muted form of paganism, so then Jews can't do business with non-Jews in Europe, in Christian Europe, 3 days before Christmas, which even then was probably the main shopping season. And that would be a problem. And these become issues. So what happens, just to give you as an example, what happens in Christian Europe is it becomes standard practice to do business with non-Jews and not to use any of the strictures the Talmud installs regarding pagans. In other words, to treat Christianity as if it is a monotheistic religion. And then comes a whole discussion of how that could be. But what is fascinating, and I'll give you a couple of other examples of this, and very often the examples are on the edge between Jews and Christians, because this has to do with the identification of Jews as Jews, how they understand themselves as compared to others. So there's multiple examples. There's comes to money lending is a major issue. Jews become money lenders in Europe. Now the Talmud explicitly prohibits lending money on interest to non-Jews. So this becomes an issue.
To non-Jews?
To non-Jews as well, yes. The Torah says specifically for Jews. The Talmud adds non-Jews. So then there becomes a whole issue. Okay, wait, how do we rationalize this? There's the wine of non-Jews, which on the one hand is very often used as collateral in loans. Because if you're in the Rhineland, that is what the business is. There's a great deal of goods that are wine is one of the most important goods that will be sold in that economy. And if you are lending, very often that will end up being your collateral. That will be what you will collect. And so there's multiple instances in which the Talmud says X, practice in Germany and in France is Y. So the general understanding of this is, and this is an idea that already Katz touches on, many others touch on. I want you to read just a passage from an article by Chaim Soloveitchik, who really is one of the great students of this particular era. And I don't know if I should just call on people or look for volunteers. I see some very, very frightened faces. Usually, when the classes are smaller and I know more of the people, I just call on people. But I won't do that tonight. But I want someone to just read this. If you're looking on the first sheet, this is Soloveitchik, Religious Law and Change, from his collected writings. And I just need, Jessica, you're going to read for me. This way you'll definitely stay awake.
Yeah, the
Franco-German community.
The Franco-German community was permeated by a profound sense of its own religiosity, of the rightness of its traditions, and could not imagine any sharp difference between its practices and the law that its members studied and observed with such devotion. The provincial Jewish community...
The Provençal.
Thank you. The Provençal Jewish community and the Spanish communities, on the other hand, wrestling as they were with what they perceived to be widespread religious laxity, had no such self-image, and it never occurred to the scholars of these communities, many of whom were in every sense the intellectual heirs of the French Sophists, to seek to align their people's practices with the written word.
Okay, so the English is a little sophisticated, but fine. But basically what he's saying is what is understood as really one of the fundamental differences between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews if you're living in the Middle Ages. And I want you to think about this, is this the way things are today? If you're an Ashkenazic Jew and you're living in the Middle Ages, and your grandfather had followed a certain course of practice, it may have been more lenient than the Talmud, it may have been more stringent than the Talmud. Whatever your grandfather did, in your mind, was obviously correct. Period. And when you're studying the Talmud and you get to a page that says, do X, and you remember that your Zeta, your grandfather, did Y, you said, we got to figure out why the Talmud doesn't fit what my grandfather did. That's the way it worked in Germany. If you lived in Spain, or even Provence, and your grandfather did, again, X, and the Talmud said Y, you ran around to your friends saying, we've got it all wrong. We have to change things. I just looked it up, and the Talmud says, do this. We've been eating it this way for many years. Doesn't matter. Go kosher your pots. All of our meat is treif. Seriously. That's, in other words, you follow the Talmud. You follow what the Talmud says. My grandfather did differently. My grandfather must have been wrong. We come from a community where obviously we were just not doing things right. If you lived in Germany, you looked at the Talmud and you said, gee, we need to interpret this Talmud. There's something very strange about it. It doesn't make any sense. Because it's not the way our grandfather did it. This is a dramatic difference, and I want you to think of how different things are today than the original Ashkenazic condition. Because I remember times where rabbis would come from Israel and they would come to New York and they would say, oh, you guys have got it all wrong. All of your meat is not kosher. I remember this story about 30 years ago, where a rabbi came in and said, oh, you guys are cutting off the fat from the hindquarters the wrong way. You're all wrong. And it's all treif. And people are all shaking. Or, they wake up one day and they say, ooh, I'm looking at the vegetables and there's these microscopic bugs and my grandmother didn't know about it. It's got to be treif. The classic German way of doing it is the opposite. The classic German way of doing it was, this is what my grandfather and grandmother did. This must be right. The Talmud says otherwise. Let me rationalize the Talmud. Let me figure that out. So that's one major difference, right? So we spoke about their attitude to the surrounding culture. The next one is most important, is to talk about their minhag. Let's go on. I'm going to skip through asceticism very quickly. If you're interested in reading this passage from the Sefer Hasidim, Ashkenazic Jews had a much stronger tendency to take upon themselves extra stringencies, to take on ascetic practices. Ashkenazic Jews are the inventors of a system of teshuvah, of repentance, called Tshuvat HaMishkal, which is called doing tshuva according to the scale. What does it mean to do tshuva according to the scale? And this is one of the innovations of the Hasidic Ashkenaz. So tshuva, as you know, is repentance. So how do you repent according to the scale? So normally we see repentance as, I did something wrong, on a psychodynamic level, I transform myself. This is the way Maimonides understands it. Yesterday I was a sinner because my mind was in this place. I try to transform my personality and my mind so that I'm no longer a sinner. Hasidic Ashkenaz came up with a completely different set of scales. They said, no, listen. If you do a sin, now I don't know what the measure unit for enjoyment is. So I guess you have to ask Jeremy Bentham, but the measure unit for joy would be, I don't know, 100 joy units. So if you did a sin, and hopefully the sin would bring you a great deal of joy at least, so it brings you X amount of joy units, right? Whatever it is, the pleasure is worth 100 points. Then you need to have 100 points of affliction.
Right.
So, if you drink non-kosher wine, so you have to fast, and then we'll come up with an amount of days. Maybe you'll have to fast 3 days to cover the non-kosher wine.
Sounds Catholic.
So there's a whole other thing there, but it's very ascetic. And by the way, that's not a completely strange remark, because don't forget, in medieval Europe, the Jews are watching, and particularly around the Crusades, this efflorescence of religious passion. So there's almost a sense of like, well, we're also serious about our religion. We're not joking about our religion. So there is a little bit of that. So there's asceticism, which is much more common amongst Ashkenaz. It's not unheard of in Sfarad, but it's very different. And then let's get to the third one, which is very, very critical. The centrality of the Talmud. How important in the curriculum is the Talmud? And in the interests of time, I will summarize the sources in front of you, but you are certainly welcome to continue to read them. The Talmud, when talking about a curriculum which one should follow when it comes to studying Torah. Now, there are many elements to the study of Torah. There is the Tanakh, the Bible, which includes multiple narrative portions, which includes all sorts of exhortations. It's not what you would call law. Most of the Tanakh, aside from really the legal sections of the 5 books of Moses, and even that is only about half of the 5 books of Moses, aside from the legal sections of the 5 books of Moses, most of the Tanakh is really very, very different types of discussions, historical discussions, discussions of poetry. So the Tanakh, the Talmud says do a third of Tanakh, a third of Mishnah, which Mishnah kind of tells you what you're supposed to do, and a third of Gemara, of Talmud study. So essentially, split up your time in thirds, but spend a third of your time studying Tanakh. Now, when it comes to Germany and Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, which is Rashi's grandson, and he is the most important rabbi you have never heard. I know you haven't heard his name often, but Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, Rashi's grandson, is his grandfather is his equal, but he may be even more significant in terms of determining the course of European halachic history. He's more significant than his grandfather. Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, so when he comes to asking Rabbeinu Tam, okay, well, the Talmud says you're supposed to divide your days a third of Tanakh and a third of Mishnah and a third of Talmud. So Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam says, but the Talmud is really mixed with all three. And he's quoting a passage in the Talmud which has its own history. It's actually meant as an insult, but whatever, it doesn't matter. It's meant as an insult that Israelis are hurling at Babylonians, but forget about the passage in the Talmud. Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam says, listen, we only study Talmud. Now, when Maimonides looks at this, he says this is a great idea. Absolutely. A third of the day Tanakh, a third of the day Mishnah, a third of the day Talmud, and then, of course, he reinterprets the Talmud to really accommodate his desire for the study of philosophy. and makes philosophy part of the Talmud. It's a completely different world. But what I want to get to, which I'm sort of skipping ahead very quickly, is how Talmudic-centric the Ashkenazic world was, and how that was not true of the Sephardic world at all. And that the Sephardic world had much broader interests. Now within Ashkenaz, there's certainly, within the Hasidic Ashkenaz, there's certainly broader interests. They are interested in mysticism. There is a whole question, and Ephraim Kanterfogel is really on the cutting edge of this, showing how even the Balei Tosfot were not quite as narrow as everyone imagined them to be, and that they had a much more broad understanding of Jewish knowledge. But clearly for the Balei Tosfot, Talmud was king. And that, by the way, stays part of it's now become the dominant role, the dominant view in Judaism. They used to go, there's a joke that they tell about asking Rav Shach of the Panovitcher Yeshiva. They went to ask him how much of Bible study should a yeshiva student engage in? How much of the Bible should a yeshiva student know? And the answer, he said, is that the yeshiva student should know every verse that is quoted in the Talmud. That was his answer, which is essentially this old-fashioned answer of study Talmud, you'll know everything you need to know. And the joke is, and it's not such a joke because it's absolutely true, is that whenever a yeshiva student marries a nice Beis Yaakov girl, and Beis Yaakov girls don't study Talmud, so they have to study the Bible, that's what they're left to study, the girl, of course, knows far more Bible than her husband does. That when it comes to looking up a verse in the Bible, she's the one who will look and find it for him, because he is completely ignorant of the Bible. This is something that Ashkenaz brought in. Now let's bring you to the next point, and what I'm trying to do is finish at 9 o'clock, which is, but there's one more point I want to talk about, and then we're going to sort of bring in also a list that Chaim Soloveitchik uses, which I think is a lovely list as well. The next point is the idea of codifying the Talmud. And this is a subdivision of the concept of being Talmudic-centric. If you look, and I know I'm just sort of skipping ahead, I'm on the third sheet at the bottom, where it's a Roman numeral 2. It's Roman numeral 2 letter to number 1, which is the issue of codification. And I quote Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah Torah, which is what he calls it. He calls it the Mishnah Torah. Let me tell you for a moment about Maimonides once we've gotten to talk about him. He's born in probably 1135. He is a codifier. He codifies among his great accomplishments. I mean, first he writes a book on logic. Then he writes a commentary to the Mishnah. Then he writes a listing of the mitzvot. Then he writes what's called the Mishnah Torah, which is this remarkable, exceptional, brilliant codification of everything found in the Talmud in this incredibly smooth and beautiful way. Now, anyone who's ever studied the Talmud knows this about the Talmud. It starts here, goes there, asks this. There is no order to the Talmud. If you're the type of person who likes to have a clean desk and everything in your room in order, the Talmud will drive you bananas. Because it starts here and goes there and goes there. It seemingly drove Maimonides a little crazy as well. And it bothered him. And he said, you know what we have to do is we have to come up with what will be essentially an upgrade. I'm going to take the Talmud, of course. I'm going to upgrade it. And he says more or less explicitly, well, this is going to be the new replacement for the Talmud, and hopefully everybody will accept it. And my book is going to be, and if you need to go back to the Talmud to check things up, you will. But what he did was say, let's take everything, let's organize it, let's get it down to simple format, none of this question and ask and answer and back and forth and this and that. Maimonides says, let's make it nice and simple and straight. And Maimonides wants to codify everything that's found in rabbinic literature put it into a set of 14 volumes, get it clear, get it straight, get it done. Now, he's not the only codifier amongst Sepharad, but it goes to show you the difference of culture when it comes to the Talmud. To Maimonides, the Talmud is, of course, the basis of Jewish practice, but it's something that needs to be wrestled down so that we can finally understand it and get it nice and neat and clean, so we know what to do. We can read it quickly. We get all of what's part of the Torah Shabbal Peh, the traditions that the oral traditions of Judaism. We get all of that done, and then people can read it clearly, know what to do, and then go on and do more important things like study philosophy. That's Maimonides. He wants to wrestle it down till we finally get it to where we need it to be. Now, if you ask the Balei Tosfot, once you get to Rabbeinu Tam and his nephew, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, once you get to these rabbis, you know what the beauty of the Talmud is? It asks so many questions. And they say, you know what? The Talmud doesn't ask enough questions. So we're going to add on a bunch of our own. We're going to have question, answer. You have an answer. I have another question on your answer. And you can go through the Balei Tosfot, and it's like this. In the Balei Tosfot, oh my God, they expect you that, okay, today I'm reading in Daf Yomi Masechet Sukkah. Okay, but don't you remember what it says in Zvachim? It seems to be a contradiction to what we're reading. Oh, let's spend some time going through that contradiction. The Balei Tosfot, the German rabbis loved the back and forth of the Talmud. For them, it was a joy. That was the whole point. You wanted to have a conclusion? Okay, we'll have a conclusion. But that wasn't the point of it. The point was not having a conclusion. That was the point of it. There was such a love of the dialectics, of the back and forth. To the Rambam, and he's not the only one, like I said, there's this sort of sense of like, wait, let's try to get a nice, concise, sort of put together code. Now I would not say codification is emblematic of the Sephardic world, but it certainly is a product of the Sephardic world. In other words, there are many Sephardic rabbis who are deeply influenced by their German colleagues. And so you have, the Ramban and the Rashba and the Ritva and all of these rabbis in 13th century Spain who are deeply influenced by the Tosafistic project. They too have their questions and their answers and their back and their forth. But I would say that the Rambam would certainly never have arisen in Germany. And there are German codes, but the German codes are more of the question and answer, and at the end you have a code. Also, one thing that's very interesting. In the Balei Tosfot, there is barely a mention of any of the great rabbis of the Sephardic area. It's something fascinating. It's like they're living in a cocoon. There is one Tosfot in all of the Talmud that makes mention of Maimonides, which is unbelievable. And that may be even a later addition into it. Now, Maimonides is a bit younger than the earliest great rabbis of the Tosfot. Rabbeinu Tam is older than him, but in other words, he's almost like a half generation ahead of him. But it doesn't matter. By the time the Tosfot project is concluded, Maimonides is well known. And he's mentioned once in the entire Tosfot project of the Talmud. That's an unbelievable thing.
What about after?
And after other rabbis too, but I'm really sticking to 11th and 12th century. So this is the various differences. Now, again, let's just review for a moment before we get to our example. Number one is connection to broader society. Number two is attitude towards custom, towards minhag. Number three is Talmudocentrism. And I sort of did it in two different ways. Okay. Those are, in codification, is sort of a footnote to being Talmudocentric. To put it in the way that Chaim puts it, I know I skipped Asceticism. He speaks about no development of religious philosophy, which is simplicity of belief, meaning not really being interested in philosophy and theology, the Bali Tosaf being much simpler. Kantorfogel, by the way, disputes that. No religious alternatives, meaning they don't really see anything else out there. Like, they see themselves as in other words, if you're not Jewish, it's like, it's a disaster, which is going to inform the most important example we're going to talk about tonight. The wide acceptance of the law by masses, which is that the Ashkenazi Jews, by and large, were much more observant than the Sephardic Jews of that era, in let's say the 12th and the 13th and even the 11th centuries, and the unwillingness to embrace leniencies. And I just want you, while you're doing this, originally the title was When Ashkenazim were Ashkenazim and Sephardim were Sephardim. But I want, while we're doing all of this, just for you to contemplate that in Ashkenaz there was no philosophy, there was a much stronger affinity to mysticism, there was much stronger observance, while Sepharad was kind of the one that was sort of religiously insecure. And today, look at where Ashkenazim and Sephardim are today. It's fascinating how the worlds have flipped over. And that, like, I know that I remember hearing a lecture from Professor Lyman many years ago in which he spoke about how that in the 13th century, the practice of doing kaparot, which is you take a chicken before Yom Kippur and you swing it over your head and you say that this should be an atonement for me. So in the 13th century, it was widely condemned as near paganism in the Sephardic communities, and it was widely accepted in Ashkenazi communities. And he said that this is a fascinating reflection of their cultures. Nowadays, if you think about it, this he didn't say, but I always say, if you think about it, the opposite is true. Although, obviously, you have a Hasidic culture that's much closer to the Ashkenazi culture of the 12th and 13th centuries than perhaps the rest of us would be, but that's a whole other discussion of what happens when Shabtai Tzvi comes through, and then there's the Misnagdim. It's for another lecture. That's why we have to have another series next year. So now, you'll give me 20 minutes to do what I think is one of the most dramatic examples. And it's an example that one of the historians of Christian Spain, Yitzchak Ber, speaks about, which is the very different attitudes towards martyrdom, both in the Ashkenazic and Sephardic world. Let's say, to give you an example, we do know that when Maimonides is one of his first major letters as a young man is to the Jews in Fez. The Jews in Fez had been forced to convert to Islam. And another rabbi came along and said that whatever mitzvot they did after they converted doesn't count anymore. In other words, let's say you convert and then you quietly try to be a Jew again. So he says, no. Secret Judaism, what in another generation is going to be called a Morano, secret Judaism, he says, doesn't count. And you're out of the family, so to speak. Your mitzvot don't count. And Maimonides writes this beautiful letter trying to support the community. Now, whether the letter is perfectly halachic is a matter of some dispute, although I think it is. And actually, the founding rabbi of the shul wrote a fair bit about Maimonides' letter on Kiddush Hashem, his letter on martyrdom. But there's certainly, when it comes to forced conversion in the Muslim world, even in the 12th century, and certainly we're going to see it in the 14th and in the 15th century in Spain, there are many that are martyrs. I don't want you to get the idea as, in Germany they all gave up their lives, and in Spain they all converted. Absolutely not. There were plenty of Jews who converted in Germany, and there were plenty of Jews who gave up their lives in Spain. But it seems, from all of the impressions we get from the writings, is that in Spain a lot of people did not convert. And in the Arab world, when there were forced conversions, a lot of people did not convert. And in Germany and in France, not only were people willing to be martyrs, but as we will see, they will even deviate from halacha and involve themselves in forms of martyrdom that to us may actually be terribly upsetting. Tonight, the rest of the lecture may be a little bit upsetting, but that's fine. It's the only way you learn, and by the way, it's one of the ways to keep you up late at night. But the contrast between the attitudes amongst Sephardic Jewry and Ashkenazi Jewry when it comes to martyrdom are rather marked, and there, when talking about this, suggests that maybe it is the influence of philosophy on Sephardic Jews. One cannot prove that in any way, shape, or form. It is a speculation, but clearly it does show a different culture. So let's take a look at martyrdom. Let's take a look at the Gemara in Sanhedrin. So here, oh boy. All right, the Gemara in Sanhedrin is over here. And it's I should have numbered the pages. But it is the second sheet on the inside. Sanhedrin 74a at the bottom. This is good. I need someone to read for me. Who do I go? Well, you okay for reading? Oh, you don't have a sheet. Okay, who has a sheet that wants to volunteer? You want to read? Okay. So we're going to read this Gemara at the bottom, and the Gemara at the bottom is going to require a quick analysis from you. From you, the audience, we're going to ask you your analysis of this Gemara. Let's come here. You'll read first.
Johanan said in the name of our Simeon Jehozadak.
Yes.
Ben Jehozadak. By
Yes.
a majority vote, it was resolved in the upper chambers of the house of Nitzah in Lida 18 that in every other law of the Torah, if a man is commanded transgress and suffer not death, he may transgress and not suffer death, excepting idolatry, incest, which includes adultery, and murder.
Okay. So now, this is, and this, I'm just looking at it now because I do not look at the translations when I insert them. I just take them off the internet. But boy, this is a very unfortunate translation. It should not say he may. He says, you say to him, it says, you say to him, or Ya'avar al Yahareg, it means it's more of an imperative rather than a choice. The Talmud basically says that, and now I can't ask you to analyze it because the English is off. The Talmud says that generally in Judaism, a threat to life is taken as more significant except in 3 instances. In other words, that we always put aside the commandment except for 3 instances. So if someone comes and says, you have to eat non-kosher, or you're going to die. And that's even if it's a case of duress, or frankly, if God forbid someone has a bleeding ulcer, and they're in the middle of a subway station and there isn't any kosher food, so they can go into Nathan's and buy a hot dog, and this way slow down the progress of the bleeding ulcer, right? So if your life is in danger, right, on Shabbos, right, I explained this past Shabbos in the sermon, on Shabbos, God forbid someone collapses in shul, you grab a phone, you call immediately 911, you don't worry about it being Shabbat. If you need to, you put the guy in a car and you zip over to the hospital, you do whatever you have to do in the face of danger. So the general rule is that you do not sacrifice your life for a mitzvah with 3 exceptions. Idolatry, which is going to be significant, and that's the one that's most important, and then of course incest and murder. Fine. Those are the 3 ones. Murder is not important today, incest is not important today, idolatry is important. Okay, this is the Talmud. Now the simple understanding of the Talmud, aside from this poor mistranslation, is the one which Maimonides institutes. Now I want to ask you the case of a guy who is too religious. So let's say someone says, and by the way, I mean tragically there are instances like this which one can talk about regarding the Holocaust. Someone says, I will not eat non-kosher food, even if it will put my life in danger. someone says, I will not eat on Yom Kippur, even if it will put my life in danger. So the simple reading of this passage, and this is the reading that the Maimonides gives it, of course it's Pashut, is that if I choose to sacrifice my life for a commandment that I should not be sacrificing my life for, out of the big three, which is idolatry, murder, and incest, out of those three, excluding those three, any other commandment, if I decide I don't want to violate Shabbat, right? I need to call the doctor to get to the hospital. I say, no, I'm too pious. I won't violate Shabbat. Someone will say to you, you might die. I'm sorry. I'd rather not violate Shabbat. So Maimonides says, you know what happens in that case? That person is liable for having killed himself. In other words, when he has to go up to the heavenly court, God will tell him, why'd you kill yourself? Why'd you do this? This is essentially the simple understanding of the Talmud. Now, in Europe, it didn't quite go this way, and I'm going to have to skip the whole discussion of the Anusim. We're going to go to Europe, okay? And we're going to talk about what happens with the Balei Tosfot. So I just told you that in an instance in which someone is threatening your life for another mitzvah, for another commandment, Maimonides, the simple reading of the text of the Talmud, would prohibit you from giving up your life for any other commandment. In Europe, the Balei Tosfot are going to change this in three distinctive ways. And I will talk in a moment of why they changed it in these three distinctive ways. But they will change the ruling of the Talmud. And on this one, I happen to agree with Soloveitchik on his conclusion of this. They will certainly change the ruling of the Talmud. And they will, in many ways, come up with some sort of a source to try to substantiate their ruling. They will change it not only to allow you to give up your life for any commandment. So if, let's say, a guy comes to you and says, I want all the Jews in the town to eat non-kosher. You're a Jewish boy, you're going to eat some pork. That the person can say, sorry, I'd rather give up my life than eat the pork. And they will justify that. Not only will they justify that, they will justify, and this is where it gets very uncomfortable, they will justify the person killing themselves before the person, let's say, in other words, let's say you're in a castle and the Crusaders are coming and they are going to pull you out and they're going to threaten your life until you bow to the cross. So they will allow preemptive suicide. Even more shocking and uncomfortable, and something that is even controversial in Ashkenaz, is that there will be rabbis who will justify the killing of their children and their spouses before the Crusaders enter. And this will give you a picture of what is really going on in Ashkenaz. What a very different culture you have. And this is a culture, and we're going to talk about how all of the elements we've spoken about, asceticism, custom, the acts of ancestors, the attitude towards the surrounding society, we're going to talk about how all of these affect the behavior when it comes to the example of martyrdom. And what is fascinating is how different and how opposite the attitude towards martyrdom is in the Ashkenazic world and in the Sephardic world. So let's talk about it. Let's start with a passage from, so this is the Tosfos HaRashba, the famous Rav Shamshon ben Avram, the Rash. If you go here, and this is 1, 2, 3. This is based, I forgot to even put, I put in the English. I put in both Englishes. So at the bottom of 3, I'm going to even skip, I'll summarize the passage in the Talmud, and I'm going to skip to what the Balei Tosfot learned from it. There's a fascinating passage in the Talmud. The passage in the Talmud, now that we're a month before Passover, becomes somewhat relevant. The passage in the Talmud wants to know, there are three young men who are taken to Babylonia by Nebuchadnezzar, and are told that they need to bow to an idol, otherwise they will be cast into a fiery furnace. Their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they do allow themselves to be cast into a fiery furnace, and in the book of Daniel we're told that a miracle saves their lives. But before the miracle saves their lives, they are essentially willing to be martyrs. So the Talmud tells us a story about Tudus Ish Romi, Tudus of Rome. Tudus of Rome says, why did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah allow themselves to be cast into the fiery furnace? So Tudus said, they decided that they would learn from the behavior of the frogs in the second plague in the times of Pharaoh. Okay, it's a cute little midrash because the frogs, we're told, were everywhere. They were in their meeting bowls. They were everywhere. And presumably they were in their ovens as well. That you would bake a pie. I remember one of my teachers in elementary school using this image. You would bake a pie, you would open it up, and inside were frogs. And my teacher was not French, so that wasn't considered to be something exciting to see. And so the idea was that the frogs are giving up their lives because God told them that you have to afflict the Egyptians. So Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah said, if frogs can give up their lives to serve God, so can we. So now, the Balei Tosfot, and the Rash, where here it's actually called Tosfos HaRashba, but it's the Rash. The Balei Tosfot ask a question. And here, I'm going to actually summarize everything because we're running low on time. So the Balei Tosfot say, 1 second. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were told to bow to an idol. So, if they were told to bow to an idol, why do they need to learn from the frogs that you shouldn't bow down? It's an obvious fact. But I know at 9 o'clock at night it's not the best time to teach you all to Tosfos logic. But this is Tosfos logic. Tosfos logic is, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah say, we're learning from the frogs what to do. And we're going to learn a Kal V'chomer from the frogs. We're going to learn from the frogs' behavior. So Tosfos, the Rashba, says, wait. Why do I need to learn it from the frogs? The Talmud in Sanhedrin already said, you have to give up your life rather than worship idolatry. So you know what the answer is? The idol that Nebuchadnezzar had made was not a true idol. It was just a statue of the king, and it was just to show respect to the king. But they decided they weren't going to bow to it anyway because they wanted to be more stringent upon themselves. Listen to this. I'm sorry I'm doing this with you 10 to 9 at night, and you may not have studied Tosfot before, so you're kind of like getting whiplash from whoa, what's going on over here. But listen to this. This is genius. The Talmud says that they learned not to bow to the idol from frogs. Why do you have to learn it from frogs? Learn it from that it's a basic responsibility. Every Jew is not allowed to worship idols. You have to give up your life rather than worship idols. So the answer is, must be the idol that was put in front of them really wasn't an idol. It was just a statue. So then why are they giving up their lives? Or what are they learning from the frogs to give up their lives? They're learning from the frogs to give up your lives, even in situations where you don't have to. Where you don't have to. Which means, based on this incredibly sort of, I don't even know what you would call it, a thin or hair-splitting logic. Based on all of this, I've come up with a completely new law. Yesterday you thought, well, not yesterday, it was just a few minutes ago, but it feels like yesterday. But just a few minutes ago you thought, you're not allowed to give up your life for any other commandment. Now, with a question on an agadic passage, which any of you are familiar with the Talmud and with halachic thinking know that an agadic passage does not have anywhere nearly, and in other words, agadic is where it tells stories rather than law. A narrative passage in the Talmud has no weight. And based on a narrative passage in the Talmud, they wake up and say, okay, you know what? If a non-Jew comes to you and says, don't eat matzah, you can give up your life. Eat the matzah and give up your life. This is a remarkable innovation. But this is what the Balei Tosfot do. Now we're going to talk in a moment why they do it. But let's go to the next innovation. The next innovation is based on a passage in the Talmud as well, which is where 400 young people decide to give up their lives rather than be brought for prostitution to Rome. This is a passage in the Talmud talking about the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. And that rather than be subject to prostitution, they give up their lives. Along comes the Balei Tosfot, and this is Rabbi Chanan. Now, let me explain to you who Rabbi Chanan is. I told you about Rabbeinu Tam. Just to give you a little bit of family. There's Rashi. Rashi has 3 daughters. Rashi lives in Troyes, which is in the Champagne region. Rashi has 3 daughters. One of his daughters has a son, actually 2 sons. One's the Rashbam, one's Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, who I told you is the most important rabbi you've never heard of. Really is like the giant of German Jewry, but we always hear about Rashi because Rashi is what you learn in elementary school. But Rabbeinu Tam is the guy. I mean, he's as big as his uncle. Now, Rabbeinu Tam's an interesting guy because, much like Dr. Johnson and Boswell, he doesn't write his own stuff. He has a nephew, right, and whose name is the Ri, Rabbi Yitzchak HaZaken. The Ri has a son named Rabbeinu Elchanan. Now, we don't know what happens with the Ri at the end of his life. We know that Rabbeinu Elchanan is killed in 1185 by some sort of a Christian massacre. Now, the Ri may have died in that massacre as well, but at that point he was an older guy. Without the Ri, we wouldn't know about the genius of Rabbeinu Tam because Rabbeinu Tam was a terrible writer. The one book that we have of his is almost unreadable because it was probably notes he wrote for himself and never intended to publish. So he was a terrible writer. But thankfully he had a nephew who caught all of his genius, and all of that genius was preserved for all time and becomes a major part of the yeshiva curriculum. So Rabbeinu Elchanan, who is the Ri's son, before unfortunate his own death, says that from this passage in Gittin, which just talks about 400 kids decide we don't want to be prostitutes, we're going to commit suicide. From the passage in Gittin, it teaches you that a Jew is allowed to commit suicide before people will come and say your religion or your life, so that they can also be certain not to suffer, not to perhaps have a moment of weakness and bow to the cross. So Rav Chanan says you're entitled to commit suicide. You're even entitled to commit suicide. So number 1, you can give up your life for other commandments. Number 2, you're entitled to commit suicide. Now number 3, which is from the Hagos HaSmach, and I'm going to I apologize because this is really some of the more fascinating stuff. You should read it when you get home. But the Hagos HaSmach says, not only are you allowed to commit suicide yourself, but, and he learns this, that you're going to be, those of you who are somewhat more familiar with some of the segments of the Torah that I'm going to quote, will be shocked. You are allowed to kill your children before the Crusaders arrive. Why are you allowed to kill your children before the Crusaders arrive? Because you're allowed to judge someone based on what ultimately will happen to them. And since an adult is required to be a martyr rather than accept Christianity, this child, if the child is abducted, may accept Christianity, and therefore you're allowed to kill the children before the Crusaders come. And this is based on the concept of Ben Sorer Umoreh, which I will leave aside for right now. So this is a third element of this remarkable concept, this remarkable change of the laws of martyrdom in Ashkenaz, in French and German Jewry. Number one, you can sacrifice your life for other commandments. Number two, you can commit suicide rather than confront the moment where you may be weak. Number three, you can kill your children before they have a chance to perhaps be abducted so that you can prevent them from being taken away. Now, this, you need to know, is, first of all, somewhat controversial, and, as I mention every year for those of you who come and join me for Tisha B'Av, is described at length by one of the Kinot. Kinah Chaf Bet, in the standard book of Kinot that we read on Tisha B'Av, and I have it here. I actually got scanned and cut it into the text. This is Kinah 22, describes this situation. But you need to know how frightening this is. And I know that you're all uncomfortable. I need you to know how uncomfortable this is, even for rabbis living in the era. And there is a description in a commentary to the Torah written by the Balei Tosfot, to the pasuk in Parshat Noach, Shofech Dam Adam Damo Yishfoch, which is the 9th chapter of Bereshit. There is a description of a debate between two rabbis, and this is the source I have at the end. Read it when you get home. Where one rabbi decides that he's going to run around the town before the Crusaders come to murder all the children so that they will not be taken by the Crusaders. And another rabbi says that he's absolutely wrong and he must stop. And if he doesn't stop, he will die. God will punish him with a terrible death. And the first rabbi does what he does, and then the Crusaders do not arrive in the town. This is just to give you a sense of how frightening and shocking it is. But now let's go back. I'm not playing for the oohs and ahs of the crowd. You need to focus on what this says about Ashkenaz and what makes Ashkenaz so different than Sfarad at that particular period of time. Ashkenaz is willing to be far more stringent. They are willing to give up their lives. They're willing to kill themselves rather than even imagine one of them becoming a Christian. Now, there needs to be explanations of what this is behind it. So first, let me tell you the biggest factor, which goes back to minhag. The explanations given for the behavior are given a generation or two after the behavior happened. In other words, a lot of these particular events are events that occur in the First Crusade in 1096. In 1096, people are already committing suicide rather than allow the Crusaders to take them. Their children and grandchildren, let's go back to the concept of minhag, they look up to their grandparents as saints. So when you read the Talmud and the Talmud says don't commit suicide or don't give up your life for another, let's say someone comes and they tell him do this and the guy says no and he gets killed. And there are 4 major chronicles of the Crusader era, which are written later, but they are Jewish chronicles of the Crusader era, and then we also have Christian sources on it. So they're hearing stories about the Zayda, who was a saint. He gave up his life. If the Zayda is a saint and he gave up his life, and the Talmud seems to imply that he's not a saint, and maybe even the opposite of a saint, I'm going to figure out how he's a saint. That's Ashkenaz. Second of all, the way they saw their surrounding society made it impossible for them to imagine anything else. And this is also a very powerful idea. And to them, the idea of a Jew becoming a Christian was nothing less, and Chaim Soloveitchik uses this line, nothing less than treason. This is what they would see it as. So martyrdom, I'm bringing this to you as the perfect example of how you can see a dramatic difference in culture between Spain and Germany, between those two different communities. Now, I'm not saying you can learn that many definitive things from it, but it gives you a taste of how different these worlds work. Is Baer correct that it's because of a Averroist philosophy? I mean, it's a particular type of philosophy. Is Baer correct because it's of extreme Aristotelian rationalism? Ich weiß nicht. But the point is, these are different cultures. And what's fascinating is to look at how some elements of the culture remain. Talmudocentrism is very much a part of Ashkenazi to this day, and not so much a part of Sepharad, although Sepharad is catching up, because that's where the Ashkenazic influence on Sepharad is really betraying itself now. And on the other hand, some of the extremism that, or I would call the religious passion, that is very much a part of Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, is not part of Ashkenaz today. And in fact, if anything, Sepharad is far more passionate than their ancestors in the 12th century. So at one point, Ashkenazim were Ashkenazim and Sephardim were Sephardim. And today it's very different. And things have changed dramatically. And martyrdom would probably be one of the great examples of how that's changed. I'm going to stop here. And I'm told I'll take 10 minutes of questions. I don't want to keep, and if people want to go, listen. Or if people want to take a nap, Jessica said she went to the sleep when she came in. If you want to take a nap now, that's fine. But if you want to ask questions, if you want to leave, whatever you want to do. Yes?
Usually ask questions. I'm going to make a comment. I think the difference is because the community that the Ashkenazim lived in, whether it be Poland or Germany, was horrific. And consequently,
What do you mean by horrific?
the life was not comfortable as it was in the Sephardi communities. And
Well, in other words, that you're saying that people who have lesser economic, I don't know if anyone's really studied the difference in economic circumstances. I can't tell you. I don't know with any certainty that Ashkenazic Jews they certainly were more oppressed, but I'm not sure if I don't know if there's any way of really defining their economic circumstances.
I wasn't
But
talking about economic, Rabbi.
Okay.
It was the behavior of the Christian to the Jews.
Exactly. Well, it's not just the behavior of the Christian to the Jews.
Consequently, they knew
Right.
what's going to happen to them.
And this is Soloveitchik's word is revulsion. He uses the word revulsion and he uses the word treason.
It's mutual.
That the attitude towards the people around them was one where they felt that they were incredibly unlettered, and they were. They were not, very often, they were not literate. They were ignorant. And at the same time, there was also this feeling of that they're constantly oppressing us. If you go to their side, it's treason. So there was a very different attitude towards their surrounding culture. You wanted to ask?
I was going to mention Masada.
Masada, okay, so
But there was neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic.
I'm going to tell you, there's okay, the Soloveitchik's theory, which he does on the Sephardic side in one way, and he does on the Ashkenazic side another way. Soloveitchik is of the opinion that clearly you can see a change from what would be normal halachic practice being justified in order to rationalize the martyrdom. Soloveitchik's critics, like Avram Grossman, come back and say, wait, we have Palestinian traditions that seem to allow for this, and in other words, traditions from Israel and Midrashim, and this becomes sort of an intramural debate over how much weight can you give to certain traditions and how influential would they have been in Germany. There certainly are other cases of zealotry. But what I would say in particular about the Masada example is that the Masada example is never recorded in the Talmud. So if you're a Talmudist, the only way you would know about it is from another book called Yosiphon, which is kind of a remake of Josephus, but you may or may not even be aware of Masada. And if you're aware of Masada, you would probably have your own, in other words, you wouldn't take that as that serious of an example. So it's interesting because Grossman does try to do things like that and say, wait, we have other precedents for the Jews in Germany, and that maybe it is a real form of halachic reasoning. And so Soloveitchik's saying, listen, I'm a yeshiva student. My father is a great Talmudist. I'm looking at this and telling you, this is not the way a Talmudist thinks. This is not the way the Baalei Tosfot would normally think. They thought this way because they had no choice but to think this way, because their grandparents had already become saints for giving up their lives, and this is what. And then he has to go into a whole historical analysis, and this is where he says this is the inflection point. This is where you can see history changing halacha. That's his important point. You can change halacha through history. Yes.
Actually, that's part of my question. It seems that you're using these issues of how they felt about their surrounding society and to justify these changes in halacha. But wouldn't you agree that it's still wrong to say that you could kill your children and that you could kill yourself for other?
To them, it was right, though.
But
that's
to
the
them,
point.
it was right. But isn't it
To us,
halakhically wrong?
but you're. I'm not saying this as you being. In other words, all of us are in this way much more similar to the Sephardi Jews of that era. In fact, we're more than the Sephardi Jews of that era.
Yeah.
We don't understand it.
Well,
It's a cultural phenomenon that we, in other words, we can't begin to appreciate what it was like to wake up in the 11th century or the 12th century somewhere in France and Germany and to walk around and look at the people around you.
But it's fine to justify it for them, but it shouldn't continue into.
You're just saying
identity.
this is wrong.
This is wrong.
Yeah, that's fine. I agree with you. But this is a history class. It's not a
Okay.
it's not a halachic.
Okay.
Yeah. No, we're not talking about this. Yes,
So our
the
question
disclaimer.
is, do it at
This
all.
is not practical halacha. Okay. This is absolutely not practical halacha. This is a history lesson. And like I said, the fascinating thing is and according to Soloveitchik, the history lesson is this: that halacha will change, which there are people who will deny, and that the Baalei Tosfot, without being conscious of it, automatically went into a mode where they rationalize something which is completely contrary to normal halachic thinking.
Right.
That's his point.
But I'm
You
not-
see the impression history makes on halacha.
But I hope it's temporary.
So the question
Okay, yes, okay, Michelle, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I didn't mean to upset you tonight. Yes, I'm sorry, Mayor, and then Vera.
So you explained historically in the 11th, 12th century how the Ashkenazim would give up their life for
Not to convert,
God.
yeah.
But where's the lesson that the Sephardim didn't do the same? And
No, so for sure, so I'll give you the examples. But first of all, an example
How
which
do
is
we know?
not perfectly chronologically correct, but when you go to 1391, where the first time that Jews are basically given the choice between converting and becoming or giving up their lives in Spain, there are even rabbis in Spain, rabbis who convert. So that's in the 14th century. But if you go to 1157 in Fez, right, where the Almohads are coming, or whatever it is, 1150, I don't know the exact date, but this is what Maimonides is writing a letter to, when the Almohads come in and say, listen, I'm putting a gun to your head. Go say that Allah, there's only one Allah, and which is the Muslims have a very simple conversion process. You read one sentence and that's it. And so they converted all to Islam, right? So when the Almohads come in, everyone converts.
So I could be a Sephardic Tosfot and say that the way they converted was not they weren't converting against.
Oh, whoa. So you are getting into what the Rambam writes a letter. So once you're going to bring it up. Mamar al Kiddush Hashem, which is really one of the most fascinating things the Rambam writes, is he basically takes on this other rabbi who has taken these converted Jews and really said, you're terrible, you're this, your mitzvot aren't mitzvot, and you don't count, and you're awful, and this and that. And he says, not at all. It's not true. And he says, you should feel good about yourselves. Of course, if you can run away, go somewhere else where you can live as a Jew, but your mitzvot are mitzvot. You shouldn't feel so terrible about what you did. You didn't have a choice. And he brings all types of agadic proofs, Maimonides, and he really comes and tries to support them. So in 1157 in Morocco, this is what's going on, my friend. In the middle of 1150s in Morocco, this is what's going on because you have a fanatical group that's coming in and just saying, convert, convert, convert. So when Sephardic Jews are faced with it, they have a different kind of attitude. Okay, that'll be it.
Yeah, I have a question. Are there Ashkenaz and Sephardi differences with respect to the laws of rape and their incidents of rape in the Torah? And there's also a set of halachot. Yeah, I was going to
I don't know if that's germane to the
You don't
discussion.
think rape is germane?
No, I don't think that is at
I
all.
thought it was useful.
Yeah. Is any or with this? I think if anyone wants to discuss afterwards, you can. But now you're free to go home. Okay.